Before the headlines, before the lawsuits, before his name became a symbol of betrayal inside the American Catholic Church, Father John Geoghan was known simply as a gentle parish priest, soft-spoken, mild-mannered, trusted. The kind of man parishioners described as good with children. The kind whose presence in a Boston area church seemed harmless, even comforting. But behind that calm exterior, investigators later discovered a pattern stretching back decades. Warnings, red flags, complaints, all of them quietly buried beneath transfers, reassurances, and the authority of the collar he wore. He entered the priesthood in the 1950s, assigned to parishes filled with young families. Early colleagues recalled him lingering after youth gatherings, volunteering for children's programs, making himself ever present in spaces where trust was assumed. When the first concerns reached superiors, they were subtle, a parent uneasy about how much attention he gave a child, another family complaining he overstepped boundaries. Each time, church officials noted the incident, spoke to him privately, and moved him to a new parish, instead of confronting the possibility that something darker was growing. Through the 1960s and 70s, the pattern hardened. Geoghan would bond with single mothers, framing himself as a spiritual guide, then spend increasing amounts of time with their children. When concerns escalated into direct allegations, the reaction followed a now familiar template: internal memos, confidential meetings, quiet relocations. And every relocation became a reset, a fresh community, a new set of parishioners unaware of his history, and more children placed in his orbit under the assumption that a priest was, by definition, safe. Former church insiders later testified that warnings were not absent, they were abundant. Psychologists recommended he be removed from ministry. Some parishioners demanded action. Yet the institutional instinct was to protect reputation over accountability. Files that would eventually become evidence in civil suits showed an almost mechanical pattern. Geoghan reassigned within days of complaints, sometimes even praised on departure. Parish bulletins announced simple transfers. The public never knew the reason. By the 1980s, the number of alleged victims had grown, but the facade held. Families who voiced concerns often felt dismissed or pressured into silence. Others were assured Geoghan was receiving counseling. Still others were told the behavior was misinterpreted. And through it all, he remained active in parish life, baptizing infants, hearing confessions, performing mass roles that reinforced his status and shielded him from suspicion. The quiet protection around him began to crack only when multiple families independently reached out to civil authorities. Their stories, consistent across time and geography, forced investigators to look beyond isolated incidents and see the decades-long pattern. Police, reviewing church records, found what one officer later described as a trail of missed chances. Every move, every memo, every suppressed report painted a picture, not just of one priest's actions, but of an institution repeatedly choosing silence over confrontation. It ends with the moment investigators deliver their early findings to prosecutors, hundreds of pages, documenting transfers, warnings, psychological evaluations, and repeated failures to intervene. A case that once looked like a single complaint now stood revealed as something far larger and far more devastating. A system that allowed Father Geoghan to remain in ministry long after the warning signs were clear. The courtroom was silent the first time Father John Geoghan entered in handcuffs. For decades, he had been protected by the quiet authority of the collar. Now, seated before a judge, he appeared frail, almost shrunken, the illusion of harmlessness finally stripped away. What began as isolated complaints had evolved into one of the most significant criminal cases ever brought against an American Catholic priest, a case that would open floodgates the church could no longer control. By the late 1990s, civil attorneys representing survivors had begun assembling a paper trail that stretched across parishes, decades, and diocesan offices. Confidential church files, once locked behind layers of internal privilege, were forced into the light. They revealed not only patterns of misconduct, but letters from psychologists warning that Geoghan posed a danger, memos documenting parental complaints, and administrative notes instructing bishops to handle matters discreetly. For survivors, these documents were more than evidence. They were validation, proof that their stories had been dismissed not because they lacked credibility, but because an institution feared scandal more than truth. Civil suits multiplied. Each one added new testimony, new documents, new families whose experiences echoed each other with frightening precision. During depositions, attorneys confronted church officials with their own words, references to moving Geoghan for his healing, discussions about avoiding public embarrassment, and internal assessments estimating dozens of potential victims. The scale was impossible to ignore. In 2002, prosecutors finally secured a criminal conviction. The charge was a single count involving one boy from the early 1990s, a fraction of the allegations, but enough to send Geoghan to state prison. For many survivors, the verdict represented a turning point. They watched as the man who once wore white vestments was escorted away in an orange jumpsuit, no longer shielded by parish walls or clerical status. But the legal consequences did not end there. Civil settlements mounted, costing the archdiocese hundreds of millions of dollars. Bankruptcy loomed. Entire diocesan structures were re-evaluated as investigators uncovered parallel patterns surrounding other clergy. Geoghan's case became a catalyst, a name invoked in legislative chambers pushing for statute of limitations, reforms, mandatory reporting laws, and national audits of diocesan responses to misconduct. Inside prison, Geoghan remained a target. In 2003, he was attacked by another inmate and later died from his injuries. His death ended the criminal proceedings, but deepened public anger. Many felt justice had arrived too late, that the system which failed to stop him in life could not even ensure his safety in custody. Even after his death, the fallout continued. Investigations expanded. Grand jury reports detailed systemic failures, documenting how bishops had repeatedly minimized or concealed complaints. Survivors' advocacy organizations grew, using Geoghan's case as a rallying point for broader reform. Internationally, other dioceses began facing their own reckonings, citing Massachusetts as the beginning of a global wave. What had started with quiet transfers and muted warnings now stood as one of the most significant institutional scandals of the modern era. And at the center of that storm was a single priest whose decades of harm forced an ancient institution into a painful and very public confrontation with its own choices. The legacy of Father John Geoghan was not measured by the number of parishes he served, but by the irreversible shift in how the world understood accountability within religious authority. His name became synonymous not only with betrayal, but with the moment silence finally shattered, and the truth refused to remain hidden. Before dawn in the foothills of the Maule region, the compound looked peaceful: whitewashed buildings, neat rows of crops, children marching in choreographed lines. But Colonia Dignidad was never what it appeared. Behind the gates, beyond the guards, the man shaping this secluded world was a former German lay preacher named Paul Schäfer, whose soft-spoken piety concealed an empire of fear. Schäfer arrived in Chile in the early 1960s with a group of German followers who believed they were escaping the corruption of post-war Europe. They settled on thousands of acres of farmland, promising a self-sufficient Christian utopia built on discipline, purity, and obedience. But even in those early years, cracks showed. Families were separated upon arrival, children assigned to communal dormitories, adults given punishing work schedules, and little contact with the outside world. Schäfer preached that the world beyond the gates was dangerous and sinful, and only strict control could preserve spiritual purity. He enforced that control through surveillance, isolation, and a rigid hierarchy. Followers were required to confess their thoughts, Letters were censored. No one could leave without permission. Schäfer positioned himself as the sole interpreter of God's will, claiming divine authority over every aspect of life, from marriages and medical care to punishments carried out in underground rooms. The Chilean countryside offered privacy, but it also attracted attention. Local officials noted that Colonia Dignidad operated like a state within a state. Its own hospital, its own schools, its own security force. Schäfer cultivated connections with politicians, donating food and medical services to nearby communities, presenting himself as a benevolent foreign servant of the Chilean people. In reality, he was building political shields. When Chile's military dictatorship rose in the 1970s, Colonia Dignidad's role darkened further. Survivors and later investigations reported that the enclave became a logistical partner to intelligence services, providing storage facilities, vehicles, and according to later testimony, a place where political detainees were brought for interrogation. Guards trained in paramilitary tactics patrolled the grounds. Schäfer's rhetoric shifted toward the language of defense, insisting the colony must be protected from outside enemies, both spiritual and political. Inside, the atmosphere grew more suffocating. Residents worked endless hours under harsh discipline. Schäfer used a mix of religious justification and psychological manipulation to demand total loyalty. Children were told their parents had failed spiritually, and adults were taught that questioning Schäfer was questioning God himself. Some followers attempted escape. Many were captured and punished. Recruits arriving from Germany found themselves in a world where passports were confiscated and dissent treated as spiritual rebellion requiring correction. By the late 1980s, rumors of abuse had spread beyond Chile. Former residents who managed to flee described punishments, disappearances, and a community living under constant fear. Journalists attempted to investigate, but were met with stone walls, legal threats, and heavily armed gatekeepers. Schäfer denied every allegation, portraying critics as attackers of a charitable mission. Yet, the seeds of exposure had been planted. International human rights groups began compiling testimonies, and Chilean authorities, now operating under a new political climate, opened preliminary inquiries. Schäfer responded by tightening control further, restricting movement even more sharply, and retreating deeper into the compound. The facade of a peaceful religious community was eroding. Foreign embassies expressed concern. Former followers described secret tunnels, locked treatment rooms, and communications intercepted by trusted guards. Each new account added weight to a growing suspicion. Colonia Dignidad was not a sanctuary, but a fortress built to protect one man's authority, insulated by decades of fear. By the end of the 1990s, Chilean courts were openly questioning Schäfer's activities, and investigators were closing in. With allegations mounting and warrants looming, the man who once held absolute control inside Colonia Dignidad quietly disappeared, setting the stage for the international manhunt that would define the next chapter. The international hunt for Pastor Paul Schäfer began quietly, almost anticlimactically, with a judge's warrant in the late 1990s. But the search quickly evolved into one of the most complex manhunts in South American history. For decades, Schäfer had operated behind the high gates of Colonia Dignidad with near total impunity. Now, after years of survivor testimony and newly empowered Chilean courts, the man who once commanded absolute obedience was finally within reach if investigators could find him. When authorities first arrived at the colony to serve the warrant, Schäfer was already gone. Followers insisted he was away for medical treatment. Others offered vague claims about travel. But intelligence reports suggested something more orchestrated. Vehicles leaving at odd hours, documentation quietly destroyed, and a network of loyalists helping him vanish into the countryside. Chile issued alerts. Germany issued inquiries. Interpol circulated notices. Yet the man who once preached against the outside world used it to disappear, slipping across borders with the help of a handful of the most devoted followers. His absence left a vacuum inside the colony, where remaining leaders attempted to maintain order amid growing police pressure. For the first time, Colonia Dignidad's gates could not keep the law out. Investigators pieced together Schäfer's escape trail through bank records, intercepted letters, and interviews with defectors who had finally begun to speak freely. They learned he had fled to Argentina, moving between rural properties and small towns where sympathetic contacts offered shelter. Local police began quiet surveillance. At the same time, Chilean prosecutors built their cases, supported by survivor testimony describing decades of authoritarian control, corporal punishment, and the use of the colony's underground structures for unlawful confinement. In 2005, after nearly a decade on the run, Argentine officers discovered Schäfer hiding in a farmhouse near the city of Córdoba. He was frail, older, and no longer the iron-willed preacher captured in archive footage, but he was still defiant. When authorities entered, he attempted to deny his identity. It didn't work. He was arrested without incident, placed in custody, and extradited to Chile under heavy security. The return set off a storm. Outside the courtroom, survivors held photographs and handwritten signs. Inside, prosecutors laid out decades of testimony. Children separated from parents, residents forced into labor, underground rooms used for punishments, political detainees allegedly brought to the colony during the dictatorship. Schäfer listened with his head bowed, saying little. His lawyers argued that the allegations were exaggerated, that he was being targeted for ideological reasons, that the colony had done charitable work. But documents, medical records, and consistent survivor accounts dismantled the defense piece by piece. In 2006, Chilean courts convicted him on charges related to abuse and unlawful detention. Additional proceedings linked the colony to human rights violations committed during the dictatorship era, though Schäfer faced only a fraction of the broader accusations due to time limits and evidentiary constraints. He received a sentence of 20 years, a symbolic acknowledgement of the far-reaching harm inflicted under his rule. Inside prison, Schäfer remained an enigmatic figure. Reports described him as withdrawn, guarded, and surrounded by a handful of followers who continued to refer to him respectfully. But even behind bars, his fall reshaped Chilean politics and international scrutiny of religious enclaves. Colonia Dignidad was placed under state intervention. Property was seized. The compound's name was later changed in an effort to shed its past. Schäfer died in 2010, ending the criminal chapter, but not the reckoning. Investigations continued into the colony's ties to political repression. Survivors demanded reparations. German and Chilean officials held joint inquiries to finally account for decades of failures. What remained after Schäfer's death was the undeniable truth. A man who promised salvation had built a fortress of fear, protected by charitable facades, political alliances, and the quiet trust placed in religious authority. His conviction marked one of the clearest instances in modern history of a spiritual figure using faith not as a path to redemption, but as a weapon for control. The small prayer room in rural Ontario always smelled of incense and damp carpet. Followers entered quietly, heads bowed, waiting for the man they called Father Jim to appear. When James Taylor finally stepped through the doorway, soft voice, white robes, silver cross catching the dim light, he looked every bit the gentle shepherd his congregation believed him to be. But that stage-managed serenity hid a darker reality. Behind the facade of deliverance sessions and prophetic declarations, Taylor had built a closed world where spiritual authority became a tool of domination. The Church of the Risen Christ began humbly in the early 2000s, meeting in rented halls and basements. Taylor spoke of healing, renewal, and a coming spiritual war. He drew in people who were lonely, grieving, or searching for purpose. He memorized their stories, their fears, their weaknesses. Over time, he positioned himself not as a pastor, but as an intermediary between them and God, the only one, he said, who could truly see the demonic forces threatening their lives. Slowly, the boundaries shifted. Taylor insisted that members limit contact with outsiders who might pollute their walk with God. Friends who questioned his teachings were labeled enemies. Family members who pushed for distance were called instruments of darkness. Followers were encouraged to move closer to the church, volunteer full-time, or sever ties with loved ones who resisted the doctrine. The community became a tight circle, united not by love, but by fear of spiritual catastrophe. During deliverance rituals, dim lights, whispered prayers, his hands tightly pressed on shoulders or foreheads. Taylor spoke with absolute certainty. "The enemy is in you," he would say. "Only I can drive it out." Followers trembling in those sessions later testified that they were told their anxiety, depression, and trauma were signs of demonic infestation. Treatment, medication, or outside counseling were condemned as signs of faithlessness. Taylor became the sole authority on their bodies, minds, and souls. As his influence grew, so did his control. Confession sessions took place behind closed doors. Taylor required minute details of personal lives, relationships, and childhood memories, which he later used to maintain psychological leverage. Members were instructed to disclose sins in writing, and Taylor kept the letters locked away, a spiritual record, he said. In truth, it was a tool that silenced dissent. Financial dependence followed. Congregants were told to donate not just tithes, but sacrificial offerings, sometimes entire paychecks, to help Taylor prepare for the spiritual battles ahead. Those who questioned the demands were shamed publicly, accused of letting Satan work through them. Some gave up careers, convinced that only full devotion would save their souls. Isolation deepened. Taylor staged prayer vigils that lasted through the night, leaving followers sleep-deprived and emotionally raw. He directed couples to separate if he believed their marriage hindered God's work. He encouraged young adults to live communally under his supervision. The church grounds became a closed ecosystem, with Taylor circulating constantly, declaring revelations that conveniently reinforced his authority. By the mid-2000s, rumors had begun leaking to the outside. A former member approached social workers, describing coercive rituals and psychological manipulation. Another contacted police after discovering that several followers had been told to keep secret one-on-one deliverance sessions that left them confused and traumatized. Investigators listened carefully. What they heard aligned with emerging concerns across Canada. Small, insular religious groups using spiritual language to mask abuse. Police obtained warrants. When they entered the church property, they found locked rooms, written confessional archives, and schedules detailing mandatory prayer sessions that lasted hours. Followers stood in the parking lot in tears as officers escorted Taylor away. Many struggled to reconcile the man they revered with the accusations they now heard from survivors. At that moment, the entire facade of the Church of the Risen Christ cracked. And as investigators began interviewing members, a clearer picture emerged, one of manipulation, spiritual intimidation, and calculated isolation implemented over years. The courthouse in Ontario was overflowing the morning James. Jim Taylor arrived for trial. Former followers sat in the gallery, clutching tissues, some trembling, some staring straight ahead, refusing to look at the man who once commanded their obedience. Others, still under the church's emotional shadow, whispered prayers, insisting Taylor had been targeted by enemies who hated God's work. The divide was stark. A congregation shattered long before the first witness took the stand. Prosecutors began with structure. They laid out the architecture of Taylor's control. The isolation from family, the confiscated phones, the required confessions, the all-night vigils. They presented diagrams of the compound, showing locked rooms, labeled as deliverance chambers, where followers underwent hours of spiritual cleansing. Each detail built toward a single theme. Taylor's authority was absolute, and he used that authority to manipulate, intimidate, and emotionally dominate the people who trusted him most. Survivors testified one by one. Their voices wavered, but their accounts formed a consistent pattern. They described being told that Taylor alone could save them from spiritual ruin. They were warned that questioning him opened the door to possession, sickness, or divine punishment. Some said they believed for years that leaving the church meant losing their families or their souls. When they cried during deliverance sessions, Taylor assured them the pain was proof God was purifying them. One former member recounted how Taylor ordered her to cut ties with her sister because her sister carried a spirit of rebellion. Another explained that Taylor demanded she work full-time at the church without pay because God rewards sacrifice better than man ever could. A young man described being kept awake for nearly 2 days during a deliverance ritual, convinced that his exhaustion was evidence of demons resisting expulsion. Defense attorneys tried to shift blame, arguing that the followers were exaggerating, that the sessions were voluntary, that Taylor's teachings were unconventional but not criminal. They insisted the church's strict structure was merely an intense interpretation of faith, and that the state was overreaching into religious freedom. But the prosecution countered with a key phrase, repeated often: faith cannot justify coercion. Then came the written confessions, the letters Taylor kept locked in his room, some decades old. Pages filled with fears, regrets, personal secrets, all handed over at Taylor's demand and never returned. Prosecutors argued these letters were weapons, used to silence dissent. The jury saw the pattern. Followers stripped of autonomy, dependent on Taylor for permission to date, to work, even to think. The letters became the physical evidence of psychological captivity. A former church leader, once part of Taylor's inner circle, delivered the most devastating testimony. He described staff meetings where Taylor discussed which members were weak, which needed breaking, which required private intervention. He admitted he'd followed orders out of fear, guilt, and indoctrination. When asked what finally pushed him to leave, he replied quietly, "I realized we were serving Jim, not God." The verdict came after only a day of deliberation. Taylor was convicted on multiple counts related to coercion, unlawful confinement, and exploitation. As the judge read the findings, Taylor stared forward, expressionless, the same blank mask he had worn during deliverance sessions, as if emotion were a luxury reserved for others. At sentencing, the courtroom grew heavier. The judge described Taylor's conduct as a systemic dismantling of human autonomy, carried out under the protective cloak of religion. He noted that spiritual authority carries particular weight and particular danger when used to isolate vulnerable people. Taylor received a lengthy custodial sentence designed to reflect both the scale of harm and the breach of moral trust. Outside the courthouse, the aftermath unfolded slowly and painfully. Survivors struggled with rebuilding family ties after years of enforced separation. Some grappled with guilt, wondering why they didn't leave sooner. Others formed support groups, trying to reclaim faith from trauma. In the town surrounding the church, residents were stunned to realize what had been happening behind closed doors for years. The Church of the Risen Christ dissolved shortly after Taylor's conviction. The compound was emptied, its meeting rooms gutted, its dormitories abandoned. But for many, the buildings were less significant than the lingering psychological scars, whispered fears, distrust of spiritual authority, and the painful memory of how devotion had been used against them. In the end, Taylor's fall became a cautionary tale across Canada, a reminder that spiritual language can mask profound manipulation, and that the line between guidance and domination can be crossed quietly over months and years, until followers cannot see they have lost their freedom. The story of Pastor Terry Millender does not open with a cult compound or a secretive ritual. It begins with packed Sunday services, polished sermons, and a reputation for prosperity that drew families in by the hundreds. His Virginia megachurch, Victorious Life Church, buzzed with the energy of a community convinced it was on the rise. Millender preached financial breakthrough, divine harvest, and the idea that wealth was a sign of spiritual favor. And for a while, everything looked exactly as promised. The cars, the clothes, the conferences, the investor meetings framed as faith-based opportunities. Behind the glossy stage lights, however, a quieter narrative was unfolding, one that many congregants would later describe as the most painful betrayal of their lives. It began with Millender's venture called Equity Financial Group, introduced during small group gatherings and church banquets as a safe, God-backed investment. Congregants were encouraged to see participation not just as financial strategy, but as an act of obedience, a way to plant a seed that would return divine increase. Millender and his wife assured followers that their funds were going overseas to help small Christian entrepreneurs. But early investors began noticing something unusual. Promised returns never arrived. Meetings were postponed, phone calls delayed, and explanations grew increasingly vague. Still, people hesitated to question their pastor, the same man who preached about loyalty, unity, and trust in God's anointed. Several victims later said they felt they would be betraying God by doubting Millender's business. Meanwhile, luxury purchases continued. Prosecutors would later outline the pattern: high-end real estate, expensive travel, designer goods, and a lifestyle that bore little resemblance to the humble service Millender described from the pulpit. Some congregants raised concerns privately, but Millender deflected with spiritual language attacks from the enemy, delays in divine timing, or temporary setbacks that required stronger faith. In one instance, a widow invested her life savings after Millender promised her that this opportunity would restore what the locusts had eaten. Another couple, already struggling financially, said they were told their giving would be multiplied tenfold if they trusted the vision. By the time suspicions hardened into fear, hundreds of thousands of dollars were gone. The final cracks emerged when a group of congregants quietly approached federal authorities, unsure whether they were reporting a crime or betraying their pastor. Investigators began tracing the money, and the story shifted rapidly. Bank records revealed that funds designated for international ministries were redirected toward personal debt and luxury expenses. What had been advertised as a faith-driven microloan project turned out to be, in the government's words, a classic fraud scheme wrapped in religious trust. When agents arrived with subpoenas, the congregation split almost instantly. Some defended Millender passionately, convinced the government was persecuting a successful black pastor. Others sat in shock, reviewing emails and receipts, and realizing the truth they had been trying not to see. Inside the church offices, investigators found documents outlining investor payments, inconsistent financial statements, and internal emails that contradicted public claims. One agent later described the case as a financial house of cards built on scripture. Millender held a press gathering insisting everything was a misunderstanding, that the church was under attack, that the investments were legitimate but delayed. But the evidence kept tightening. One by one, victims came forward: retirees, single mothers, families barely making rent, all describing how they trusted Millender because he was their pastor, their counselor, their spiritual father. The turning point came when prosecutors revealed that a second investment scheme, Kingdom Commodities International, followed the same pattern: church-based recruitment, promises of risk-free returns, and funds quickly drained into Millender's personal accounts. By the time investigation begins, the image of a charismatic leader is collapsing under the weight of bank ledgers, victim testimonies, and the realization that faith itself had been weaponized. The cliffhanger hangs heavy. The federal case is ready. The congregation is fractured, and Melinda is about to face the consequences of a betrayal that reached far beyond money. The federal courthouse in Alexandria hummed with a tension that felt almost spiritual in its weight. Victims filled the benches, some angry, some confused, some still wearing the Sunday smiles they had perfected during years of worship under Pastor Terry Melinda. But now they were here as witnesses, not congregants, waiting for prosecutors to reveal how a man who once promised them abundance had siphoned their trust into personal gain. The government's case opened with numbers, not sermons, bank transfers, loan documents, investment contracts, and ledgers that showed millions flowing through a maze of shell companies linked to Melinda and his wife. Prosecutors pointed out a pattern so precise it left little room for doubt. Church members recruited during Bible study, told to invest in what they believed were faith-backed ventures aimed at helping struggling Christian entrepreneurs overseas. In reality, investigators traced the money to mortgage payments, overdue bills, and international travel booked under Melinda's name. One of the FBI agents described the scheme with clinical clarity. Religious trust was the primary vehicle. The phrase echoed through the courtroom like a warning bell. This was not just financial fraud, it was fraud committed through scripture, prayer, and pastoral authority. Former congregants testified in quiet, trembling voices. A retired couple explained how they entrusted their savings to Melinda after he told them God was preparing them for a season of prosperity. A single mother described giving money meant for her son's tuition because Melinda promised a divine return. Another man broke down recounting how he sold his car to invest, believing he was helping spread Christian opportunity in developing nations. Defense attorneys attempted to reframe the narrative. They argued Melinda was not a criminal, but an overzealous visionary whose businesses failed due to poor management and market volatility. They insisted he planned to repay every investor and had no intent to deceive. They painted him as a pastor overwhelmed by administrative burdens and entrepreneurial dreams, not a manipulator. But the prosecution countered with emails and recorded calls. In several messages, Melinda dismissed investor complaints as attacks from the enemy. In another, he told a follower that delays were a test of faith, even as he used their funds to clear personal credit card debt. Financial experts testified that the investment structures Melinda created were fundamentally unsustainable, designed not to grow capital, but to disguise losses and keep new money flowing. The most damning moment came when a cooperating witness, once a close church associate, took the stand. He described internal meetings where Melinda allegedly discussed using religious language to reassure nervous investors, reminding staff that fear could be countered with scripture-based confidence. The witness admitted he had participated, ashamed of his own role. People trusted him because he was their pastor, he said, and he used that trust like currency. The jury absorbed every word. When closing arguments finished, they deliberated less than 2 days. The verdict was decisive: guilty on multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. As the clerk read the judgment, Melinda sat motionless, the same practiced composure he used in the pulpit, but stripped of its charisma. Sentencing brought its own emotional storm. Victims filled the courtroom once more, listening as the judge described the deep moral injury of exploiting congregants who sought spiritual guidance. He emphasized that leadership in a faith community carries heightened ethical responsibility, and that using scripture to induce financial investment is a breach of that responsibility at the highest level. Melinda received a significant federal sentence. His wife and another associate were also convicted. But the courtroom's final blow came in the discussion of restitution. Many victims had lost life savings, tuition funds, or retirement reserves. Federal attorneys admitted that full recovery was unlikely. Years of litigation lay ahead, and assets were limited. Outside the courthouse, community trauma lingered. The church dissolved, leaving members spiritually uprooted and financially shaken. Local pastors held joint services to provide support, acknowledging the painful truth. The damage extended far beyond money. It had fractured belief itself, leaving people unsure whom they could trust again. As the doors closed on the Melenda case, the lesson echoed far beyond Virginia. When spiritual authority is misused, the wounds cut through bank accounts, families, and entire faith communities, leaving scars that no verdict can fully repair. The story of Father Charles Silvestre stretches across half a century, a timeline so long and a list of parishes so scattered that his crimes were able to hide inside the folds of institutional silence. Part 9 opens not in a courtroom, but in a small Ontario parish in the 1950s, where parents still believed priests were unquestionable guardians of morality. Silvestre leaned on that cultural reverence with ease. His soft voice, gentle demeanor, and constant presence at community events made him appear like the safest man in any room. But behind the reputation was a pattern that would take decades for survivors to name and even longer for the church to acknowledge. As he moved from parish to parish, Sarnia, Windsor, Chatham, Payne Court, the same complaints followed him. Young girls confided in parents about unsettling encounters, unexpected visits, inappropriate guidance, unsettling physical closeness. Often, the response was disbelief. A priest would never. He must have meant something else. Some families confided in bishops or parish leadership. Meetings were held quietly. And then, almost like clockwork, Silvestre was transferred to another parish where the cycle began again. Institutional records later revealed the pattern with painful clarity. Warnings noted but minimized. Behavioral concerns mentioned without action. Internal memos suggesting close supervision, but no concrete restrictions. Each transfer became both a shield and an escape route. Survivors would later say, it felt like speaking into a void, the truth swallowed by an institution more concerned with reputation than confrontation. As the decades passed, victims grew older. Some tried to bury the memories. Others carried guilt or confusion, believing they had somehow misunderstood what happened. But when multiple women, now adults, independently came forward around the same time in the early 2000s, the silence cracked. Their stories shared the same core details: being singled out for attention, isolated under the guise of spiritual counseling, and subjected to acts that stripped them of safety in both their homes and their faith. One survivor described being a child in the confessional, hearing the soft click of the door closing behind her, realizing too late she was alone again with him. Another recalled the way Silvestre would reframe his actions as lessons in purity, twisting religious language to mask wrongdoing. The most heartbreaking detail woven through their accounts was the same sentence repeated by many. I thought nobody would believe me because he was a priest. The police investigation that finally began was unusually broad. Officers contacted parishes stretching across decades, compiling stories from women who had never met one another but could describe Silvestre's patterns with striking consistency. Detectives were stunned not only by the volume of allegations but by how long the pattern had been able to continue unchecked. Internal church documents surfaced, revealing a history of complaints that were handled internally, meaning quietly filed away rather than escalated to authorities. As media coverage intensified, more survivors found the courage to come forward. Some spoke publicly, others anonymously. Their voices finally formed a collective force strong enough to break through the institutional walls that had protected Silvestre for so long. And it became clear that the tragedy extended far beyond the physical acts. It encompassed decades of lost trust, fractured faith, and the emotional aftermath carried by women who had spent their entire lives trying to understand what had happened to them. After 50 years of transfers, ignored complaints, and silent hallways, the question now stood starkly before the public. Would the legal system finally hold Father Charles Silvestre accountable? Or would the pattern of institutional protection continue into yet another decade? The courtroom in London, Ontario, felt impossibly quiet as the first survivor stepped forward to deliver her testimony. Many of the women who sat behind her were in their 40s, 50s, even 60s, yet every word they prepared to speak returned them to childhood moments they had waited decades to name aloud. Father Charles Silvestre, now an elderly man in a wheelchair, sat only a few feet away. For years he had been protected by silence, by transfers, by the cultural shield surrounding clergy. But in this room, none of that insulation mattered anymore. Prosecutors opened with a timeline stretching more than 50 years. A staggering map of parishes, complaints, and administrative notes. Documents revealed that concerns had been raised as early as the 1950s, with parents approaching superiors about inappropriate behavior. Each entry carried a similar pattern. Noted. Addressed internally. Reassignment recommended. It was only in the early 2000s, when multiple women independently filed police reports, that a criminal case finally took shape. The charges were extensive. More than 40 counts of indecent assault, representing dozens of women whose stories shared the same signature structure. Isolation, emotional grooming, and exploitation disguised as spiritual guidance. And although some incidents fell outside the legal window for prosecution, the Crown emphasized the cumulative harm, the lifelong impact, and the clear pattern of deliberate predation. Survivors took the stand one by one. They spoke about being children who were taught to trust priests above all others, children who believed spiritual authority was absolute. Many described how their complaints were minimized or dismissed when they first tried to speak out, not by strangers, but by their own families, parishioners, even school staff who insisted they must be misinterpreting the behavior of a holy man. For several women, this was the first time they were ever publicly believed. Their voices broke, steadied, and rose again as they described how the trauma followed them into adulthood, shaping relationships, self-worth, and faith itself. Defense counsel did not try to deny the allegations outright. Instead, they pointed to Silvestre's age, frailty, and declining health, suggesting he was not physically capable of understanding the full scale of the trial. But the judge pushed back firmly. The issue was not Silvestre's present condition. It was the decades of unchecked harm he caused when he held considerable power, mobility, and influence. When Silvestre entered his plea guilty, the room exhaled. It was not the dramatic, defiant stance some expected. Instead, he offered a short, halting apology, acknowledging wrongdoing but avoiding specifics. Many survivors said afterward that the apology felt rehearsed, incomplete, or aimed more at the court than at them. A few said they felt nothing. Others said it was the first time in their lives they heard the man who harmed them admit anything at all. During sentencing, the judge delivered a strongly worded statement. He condemned not only Silvestre's actions, but the institutional failures that allowed him to continue moving from parish to parish unchecked. He emphasized the courage of the survivors who came forward and noted that the justice system depended on their willingness to relive painful memories. He sentenced Silvestre to 3 years in prison, the maximum available under the laws in place when the crimes occurred. Outside the courthouse, survivors stood together in a quiet cluster. Some cried, some embraced, some simply breathed in the cold Canadian air with a sense of release. One woman said she felt light for the first time in 50 years. Another, who had traveled from across the country to testify, told reporters, "It's not about how long he serves. It's about finally hearing the truth spoken out loud." In the aftermath of the case, the Catholic Church in Canada faced intense scrutiny. Diocesan officials issued formal apologies, acknowledging decades of oversight failures and pledging reforms in reporting procedures, child protection policies, and transparency. Training programs were implemented, mandatory reporting rules expanded, and independent review panels established. But many survivors noted that reforms, while necessary, could never undo the decades of silence that allowed Silvestre to continue. Silvestre died shortly after his incarceration began. For some, his death brought closure. For others, it felt anticlimactic, a quiet end for a man whose crimes had shaped entire lives. Yet the legacy of the case remained powerful. It forced institutions to confront their past, empowered survivors to speak publicly, and became a lasting reminder that faith, when misused, can create harm that stretches across generations. Before dawn broke over the outskirts of Port Harcourt, a young woman walked toward a modest church building with her head down and her hands clasped tightly. Neighbors later said she looked frightened, as if torn between devotion and dread. Inside that small sanctuary, Pastor Richmond Ishiaka was already pacing, quoting scripture with an intensity that had increasingly unsettled members of his congregation. What began years earlier as a lively Pentecostal ministry filled with singing, deliverance sessions, and promises of prosperity had hardened into something darker, something that demanded unquestioning obedience rather than faith. Ishiaka's sermons had been shifting for months. Former congregants described a slow slide into radical teachings, warnings that disobedience invited curses, claims that enemies lurked everywhere, and pronouncements that only he possessed divine sight. He urged members to cut ties with outsiders, insisting that friends, neighbors, even family members who doubted him were agents of destruction. For some, this isolation strengthened their loyalty. For others, it planted fear. And for one woman, it set the stage for tragedy. The victim, a devoted church member in her 20s, had been struggling with personal and financial challenges. Instead of offering comfort, Ishiaka framed her difficulties as evidence of spiritual contamination. Witnesses later testified that he repeatedly singled her out during services, declaring that she needed cleansing and total submission. She trusted him. He was her pastor, her counselor, the man her community treated as a conduit between heaven and earth. But beneath the righteous front, investigators would say later, he was cultivating absolute control. In the days leading up to the crime, his rhetoric escalated. According to court statements, he told select followers that a ritual purification was necessary to break the demons holding the church back. Several congregants quietly distanced themselves, sensing danger. Others stayed, convinced his visions were true. The victim, caught between fear and faith, obeyed when he ordered her to meet him alone for a midnight deliverance. What happened next unfolded in a dimly lit room behind the sanctuary. A room where candles flickered, furniture had been cleared, and implements used in so-called ritual cleansing were laid out. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices, then a sharp crash, then silence. By morning, the woman lay dead. And Pastor Ishiaka offered an explanation that shifted with every retelling: a spiritual battle gone wrong, an unforeseen collapse, an accident during prayer. None of it matched the forensic evidence. When police arrived, they found inconsistencies everywhere, marks on the victim that contradicted his story, objects hastily hidden under cloth, church members trembling as they tried to explain what they had seen or heard. Some admitted they had been told to remain silent. Others confessed they feared retaliation if they spoke against their pastor. The air was heavy with a mix of shock and guilt. How had a place meant for hope become the site of such violence? As investigators pieced together the final hours, a clearer picture formed. This was not spontaneous. This was not spiritual warfare. This was coercion, power imbalance, and a belief system twisted into something fatal. The prosecution later described it as ritual-influenced homicide, a term reflecting both the religious framing and the deliberate human choices behind it. Media coverage spread quickly, fueled by community outrage and the chilling fact that the victim had sought help from the very man who ended her life. Articles highlighted the broader issue of unregulated religious spaces where charismatic leaders wield unchecked influence. Interviews with former congregants painted a picture of a pastor who had slipped further into authoritarian control, his teachings growing more extreme as his personal life spiraled into secrecy. By the time police escorted him away from the church building, crowds had gathered outside. Some wept, some shouted, some prayed aloud, trying to reconcile their memories of the man they once trusted with the reality now unfolding. Ishiaka kept insisting he was innocent, that the woman had been claimed by forces beyond him. But investigators said the evidence told a different story. And as this chapter closes, the cliffhanger emerges, with disturbing witness accounts and forensic contradictions piling up. The courtroom ahead will determine whether Pastor Richmond Ishiaka's radical teachings mask something far more calculated, something that will soon be laid bare in Part 12. The trial opened in a packed Port Harcourt courtroom, sunlight spilling across wooden benches filled with villagers, former congregants, reporters, and quiet onlookers who had followed every headline since the night the young woman died in Pastor Richmond Ishiaka's church. Court officers struggled to maintain order. Every time Ishiaka was led inside, whispers rippled through the room, some fearful, some furious, some still convinced he had been framed by spiritual enemies. He walked slowly but confidently, clutching a small Bible, his expression shifting between solemn resignation and a faint, unsettling calm. Prosecutors began by laying out a timeline that dismantled his earlier explanations. They displayed photos of the church's back room, showing candles, cloth-draped objects, and implements used in the so-called deliverance rituals. They introduced witness statements describing the victim's growing fear, her repeated attempts to please a pastor who insisted she was under attack by unseen forces. And they presented forensic findings, injuries inconsistent with accidental collapse, signs of restraint, and traces of hurried cleanup in corners of the room. According to investigators, these details painted a picture not of a spiritual emergency, but of deliberate escalation. A key witness, a former church worker, took the stand with trembling hands. She recounted how Ishiaka told select members that the victim was holding back the ministry and needed to undergo complete cleansing. When she hesitated to participate, he allegedly warned her about disobedience. The prosecution framed this not as mystical language, but as psychological pressure from a leader whose authority had gone unchecked. Another witness recalled hearing a shout the night of the death, a cry that abruptly cut off, and seeing Ishiaka emerge moments later, sweating and agitated, insisting everything was in God's control. Throughout the proceedings, the pastor maintained his innocence. His lawyers argued that the victim collapsed during an intense prayer session, that Ishiaka attempted to revive her, and that any marks on her body were the result of frantic attempts to restrain her during what they called a spiritual convulsion. They raised questions about bias against charismatic churches, noting that cultural misunderstandings had historically fueled unfair assumptions about Pentecostal rituals. They emphasized that some witnesses were disgruntled former members with personal grudges. But the prosecution countered with consistency. Their witnesses came from different backgrounds, some still faithful Christians, others disillusioned, others simply neighbors disturbed by the pastor's late-night activities. Their accounts overlapped in critical ways: isolation, pressure, secrecy, and a pattern of teachings that shifted from encouragement to control. Medical experts further undermined the defense's narrative, describing injury patterns inconsistent with any known form of seizure or collapse. According to their testimony, the evidence pointed toward sustained force, not sudden medical failure. Outside the courthouse, journalists interviewed community members divided between disbelief and anger. Some described Ishiaka as a once gentle pastor who helped the poor and preached hope. Others said they saw warning signs years earlier: the increasing authoritarian tone, his constant references to unseen enemies, the way he demanded total loyalty. The victim's family, dignified but visibly shattered, attended every session. They avoided interviews but released a quiet statement urging people to Seek truth over fear. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom fell silent. The judge summarized the findings: coercive influence, ritual framing used as cover, and actions that led directly to the victim's death. He stressed that while religious freedom is protected, it cannot be used to justify harm. He noted the pastor's shifting explanations, the forensic contradictions, and the credible witness accounts. With these considerations, he declared Pastor Richmond Ishiaka guilty. The sentence was severe: a lengthy prison term reflecting both the gravity of the crime and the abuse of spiritual trust. The judge emphasized the need for deterrence, not against religion, but against leaders who exploit faith to manipulate and endanger vulnerable followers. Gasps rippled across the room. Some congregants sobbed. Others nodded quietly, as if finally able to exhale. Ishiaka bowed his head, but showed little visible emotion. He whispered to his lawyer, then closed his eyes, as officers moved to escort him away. Outside, the media documented every reaction. Commentators debated the broader implications: the need for oversight in independent religious movements, the dangers of charismatic authority without accountability, the vulnerability of worshippers seeking guidance. Survivors of other churches reached out online, sharing stories of coercion, pressure, and fear, stories that echoed the dynamics seen in this case. As the courthouse emptied, the victim's family stood together in the fading afternoon light. They did not celebrate, they simply held one another. For them, justice did not undo the loss, but it acknowledged it. It named what happened. It ensured her story would not disappear behind religious walls. Snow fell quietly over the grounds of Street, John's school for the deaf. The flakes drifting past old brick walls and dim windows that once sheltered generations of children who came seeking education, safety, and belonging. In the 1950s through the 1970s, parents entrusted their sons and daughters to the school, believing it to be a sanctuary, a place where faith and compassion would guide every lesson. But deep inside those halls, behind chapel doors and in dormitory corridors, a very different story was unfolding. At the center of it stood Father Lawrence Murphy, the school's longtime director and spiritual authority, a man whose soft smile and gentle manner concealed years of predatory behavior that would later be described as one of the most devastating scandals in the history of Catholic education in the United States. Students who testified decades later said Murphy targeted the most vulnerable children who relied on sign language, who could not easily report their experiences to adults unfamiliar with their communication, who lived full-time under church care. He used affection as a weapon, disguising exploitation as guidance, comfort, or tutoring. Several survivors said he called them to his office at night. Others said he approached them during confession, when their defenses were lowest. Many of them were too young to understand what was happening, and those who tried to communicate it were often dismissed or misunderstood. According to church files, later revealed publicly, complaints began surfacing in the early 1960s, but instead of removing him, superiors quietly shifted him to other roles and urged silence. The institutional paper trail, uncovered decades later, showed a pattern repeated across many dioceses but especially stark here. Letters from concerned parents were archived but not escalated. Internal memos described problems at the school without naming the victims. A bishop's note from that period expressed worry about scandal if the situation became public. At no point in those years did records show a serious attempt to notify law enforcement. Instead, Father Murphy continued his duties, celebrated Mass, supervised children, and maintained the respected image of a priest serving a community that often faced social isolation due to its hearing impairments. For survivors, the consequences lasted a lifetime. Many spoke of struggling with trust, relationships, and spiritual identity. Some said the betrayal felt doubled, not only by a man who claimed to represent divine care, but by an institution that failed to protect them. In the 1990s, As adults, a group of former students finally brought their experiences into public view, filing lawsuits and contacting diocesan leaders, demanding accountability. They were no longer children with limited means to express themselves. They were grown men determined to force their voices into a world that had ignored them. It was then that previously hidden church documents began to emerge. Files detailing complaints, attempts at quiet reassignment, and internal discussions became central to the case. Advocates argued that the evidence showed not only misconduct by one priest, but a broader environment of institutional protection. Journalists and legal teams documented that more than 200 boys may have been harmed across Murphy's decades at the school. The sheer scale stunned the public. It challenged assumptions about isolated wrongdoing and highlighted systemic barriers that silenced vulnerable populations. As calls for justice grew louder, church officials offered apologies, acknowledging failures and expressing deep regret. But the man at the center of the tragedy never faced trial. In the late 1990s, Father Murphy died before criminal proceedings could fully move forward. For many survivors, his death felt like the closing of a door that had barely begun to open. They had hoped to see him answer publicly for what happened. Instead, they were left with questions and a determination to ensure their stories would not vanish. In the years after Murphy's death, the case became a crucial reference point in discussions about institutional accountability, safeguarding children, and improving communication access for the deaf community. Policies around mandatory reporting strengthened. Advocacy groups formed support networks for survivors. And the name of St. John's School for the Deaf became a symbol not only of pain, but of resilience. A reminder that silence, once broken, can transform entire systems. As this profile closes, the emotional impact lingers. A generation of children robbed of safety within walls meant to protect them. A priest shielded by authority, and a truth carried forward by survivors who refused to let their experiences remain buried.